Thank you for coming, everyone. I know this is a particularly tricky topic, but today we are going to talk about some document accessibility best practices. This will provide a very brief overview of what we're going to be covering. So we're going to be talking about not just about documents necessarily, but also best practices for HTML, which are more or less, we're talking about Drupal pages in this context here. We're also going to be talking about some of the best practices that we've covered before, and some of those will explain which still hold true, and others that we are actually going to be taking a different approach on. And then we're going to be actually covering the best practices for each of these formats for displaying content, including going over the process of converting a Word document to PDF, which might seem a bit contradictory to what we've taught in the past, and it is, but we're going to be discussing some of the reasons for why that's the case here. I would also like to thank and introduce our guest here today, Jeffrey Borish. He is on the ASC Web Services accessibility team. Jeff, do you want to introduce yourself and maybe explain what you do?
Hey, yeah. Like Zach said, my name is Jeff, and I've been here for a couple of years now doing accessibility. We mostly support the work that faculty do and administrative staff to make sure that the work that they produce is accessible. We also do a lot of testing of outside tools for things that want to be used in the classroom or as part of the business university. So yeah, covers a lot of ground, and we're always learning as well. So if you have an interesting question, sometimes it's not something that we'll know what to do right off the bat with, but we know how to go find the answers. So I would encourage people to um, reach out to us if you have any questions about something accessibility related, or we have our own office hours that happens every Wednesday at 11. And maybe we can get some links together to go in a follow up email about that.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. So thanks for explaining all that, Jeff. Um, you're definitely going to be the expertise behind this one. So I'm more or less going off what the web services accessibility team has told me. So this has been signed off on. So like I said before, we're going to be covering primarily PDFs and Word documents, but we will also be covering how HTML documents play a role in document accessibility or just general web content digital accessibility. So some of the things that we've talked about before, I know I've made content about this in the past. Some of these are things that we will still recommend to some extent. Others we are going to be backtracking on. We're going to explain which of those things are and why that's the case. I would keep in mind though that these are not necessarily 100% hard and fast rules that one has to like take on their word. Some of these are very complicated subjects. A lot of it is a matter of debate. And a thing I've learned, especially recently, is that some of the assumptions that we initially had weren't necessarily the case. So I would also lastly suggest that to keep in mind that these are generalizations here. So these are not always going to be 100% true in every single case. You can make arguments to the contrary. But that's why we come up with these best practices to kind of help you navigate some of that uncertainty. One of the things that we talked about in the past, and I know I've harped on this quite a bit, are that Word documents are generally more accessible alternatives to PDFs. And there are arguments for why you could make this case. But for the most part, we're going to explain why we no longer are going to be preaching this for the most part. Another thing that we've talked about before are that properly tagged PDFs can still have some problematic aspects for accessibility, that read-only Word documents are preferable to embedded PDF files on a page for users. And if you can, make a PDF's content into a web page, which this last one is still generally true. And we're going to explain why that's the case here in a moment. So just as a bit of a visual cue, anything that is going to be what we consider a best practice, I've marked these in red. So just to kind of make this easier to skim. So in the past, we suggested that using read-only Word documents on a web page instead of PDFs is the more accessible route here. And the reason we recommended this was because, structurally speaking, a Word doc file can sometimes be easier for a screen reader to navigate, or other assisted devices, not just screen readers, but screen readers in particular, tend to have an easier time navigating the structure of a Word document than a PDF. And Jeff can weigh in on that too, but some of the issues that we have that have more or less kind of countered that assumption in the past. For one, a read-only Word document requires Microsoft Word to be already installed on the device. You have to download the document first, and users typically have to wait for Microsoft Word to load before opening a file. And the one exception to that rule, though, is that users who use Microsoft Edge as their default web browser. The exception here is that Word documents tend to load almost instantly on Microsoft Edge. But the thing is, proportionally speaking, most users tend not to use Microsoft Edge in comparison to other platforms like Chrome or Firefox or Safari. That's the only exception, but still. But yeah, this is why we are a little bit more cautious about recommending the read-only Word documents in the future. Jeff, is there anything that you'd like to weigh in on that before I continue?
Yeah, it should be, let's see. I think as far as PDFs loading in the browser, it's true that you can more easily look at them. I think that helps people who aren't using assistive technology. The experience of trying to screen read through a PDF in a browser tab is pretty terrible. So I would think that most users are going to be downloading the PDF anyway and opening it in Acrobat. But it's true that the friction of needing to have Word installed, and true that it's free pretty much to anyone at the university. We can't say that about the public at large, that it's gonna be very convenient for them.
Yeah, I think that was the part I was trying to communicate, was that there is that general kind of friction, and taking into proportion the fact that who our audience is a very key factor here in determining whether to use something like a PDF or a Word document. And just the matter of fact is that because we are a public institution, our audience is more or less the general public for a lot of the work that we do. So that's pretty much a bit of a summary, just kind of like a very short description of the things that we've covered in the past, and some of the best practices that we've recommended before. But the next section going forward, this is going to describe what we recommend as of now. So as Jeff's mentioned earlier, we're still learning ourselves. A lot of these things are not necessarily set in stone. We were doing our best to keep up with what the current trends are and best recommendations are. So in this case, I mentioned before that if you can, it is best to display content as a HTML page in Drupal as opposed to PDF or Word. And this is because, generally speaking, HTML pages are the most accessible format for displaying content. And we'll go into the reasons for why that is shortly. And just so there's no confusion, HTML pages are content types such as basic pages and landing pages. But if you're going to be converting content over from a file or a document, it's most likely going to be basic pages that we're talking about here. So one of the best practices that we recommend too is to properly structure your HTML pages. And this is where the advantage of HTML really kind of comes into play here. So if you look to the right on both of these diagrams here, you can get a good idea for what the structure of the page is and what kind of content is on the page. So as sighted users, we can easily rely on the visual cues to navigate the environment of a page while also knowing what's in the environment, what it constitutes, whether something's an image or an article or a slide, something like that. And screen readers and other assistive devices rely on HTML code to help navigate the page rather than visual cues. And they do this by using what are called semantic tags to tell users what they're essentially hovering over, or what is currently on the page, what are they currently tabbed on, those kind of things. Whether something is a link or a header or a footer. This is where semantic tags come into play. And you don't necessarily need to know this for your own day-to-day work. Because we work in Drupal, we're not necessarily coders, right? We rely on the content management system itself to construct this code for us. But this is for just so you are aware of how a screen reader actually works or other assisted devices work. The non-semantic HTML, these are like your divs, your spans, and all this. These are more or less structure. Whereas the semantic stuff, that is the actual description of the content or the context of it. One of the things that is vital for making sure that your HTML pages are accessible are headings. They're more or less another kind of semantic tag, right? These are the things that are like header 1, header 2, header 3, and so on and so forth. These provide the backbone for your page, but they're also providing the logical structure that a screen reader device is using to navigate the page, while also telling what each variety of thing is. So this next section, this is more or less a list of best practices that we recommend for your Drupal pages. So like I said before, using headings to give pages a logical and systemic structure. So for the most part, you don't necessarily have to worry about H1 because that's already built in to the basic pages and all the other pages as well. That's your title. What will probably mostly concern you, though, is just making sure that your H2 headings are providing these are more or less your sections, the sections of your web page in general. And everything that descends from that, these are more subsections of each of that. Jeff, I think you might, is there something that you would want to add before I continue with the rest of the stuff about that, or should I keep going?
No, you're doing great. I think the thing to think about regarding like web pages versus documents is that the content editor in Drupal has it provides a lot of guidance. So you've got the way you make a heading is with by changing the type of the text to like a heading 2, heading 3, and so forth. If you want lists, you've got the list button. Where with documents, you pretty much start out with a blank page and you just start typing. And you can pretty much do whatever you want in there, sort of like writing old-fashioned web pages from scratch. So you don't have any kind of guardrails about creating the content in documents. And that's why you have to be a little bit more careful in doing that and taking a little bit more time to check the accessibility of what you create in documents versus web pages. And that gets back to why we recommend if something can be a web page, making it a web page is going to make everyone's life easier.
Jeff saying the things that I should be saying, but much more concisely.
You're doing great.
Moving on. So in addition to the headings and stuff, we also recommend using bullet or numbered lists when describing a series of items. In my experience, this benefits everybody. This isn't necessarily just an accessibility issue. A screen reader is able to, I believe, better navigate a list rather than just a series of items just in a single paragraph. And for sighted users, this is beneficial because it helps them skim what's on your page. And for users that rely on screen readers, this helps, more or less helps the device determine to easily parse through what certain things are in the context of a paragraph. Next thing, making sure your alt text is concise and accurate, not only describing just what the image is, but also the context. And the good thing about Drupal is that it's more or less built to kind of force you to put alt text in, but it's not built in a way that can make you write good alt text. So this is why I would recommend making sure, just asking yourself if your alt text, if you had to rely on a screen reader to know what an image is it describing what you would need to know? Keeping your paragraphs as short as possible. This is, again, one of those things that tends to benefit everyone. It makes everything easier to skim. And for users with screen readers, it's also easy to navigate as well. And by this, we mean probably keeping your paragraphs anywhere from 1 to 3 sentences, which is just a very good practice in web writing in general. And last, link text should tell the user where the link will take them. And this means avoiding language like click here or something like that. It helps to provide a little bit of context about what page will this take them to, what kind of content will this take them to. And this isn't necessarily something that you have to be constantly vigilant about. Oh, Jeff, do you want to say something?
Yeah, you mentioned people skimming the page a few times back there, and that's a super good thing to talk about. When you talk about marking things as headings, the headings should be marked as headings, the list should be marked as lists, and things like that. And what you were just saying about making the links some kind of text that gives context about where the link goes. Screen reader users and even other assistive technology users, they do their skimming in a different way than visual users. They have features in those tools where they can pull up a list of every link in the page and just have the screen reader read those. They can navigate by heading, just go hit a key and it goes to the next heading and it'll tell them what level they're at. So that means that the level of the heading that you use is very important. You don't want to jump from the title that's a H1 to an H4 because that is kind of confusing when you're trying to make sense of the headings on the page as an outline of what's on the page. Another thing with lists, it'll announce how many items are in the list when you hit it. And, it happens. There's people who put like 80 things in a list. I haven't seen any here at the university, but it happens. And a feature that the screen reader can use is to just say, I don't really think this is going to be useful to me. I'm going to jump past this list. Where if it's not formatted as a list, they're kind of stuck like going from one item to the next and never knowing when it's going to end. So that is the reason why semantic markup, and that's just a fancy word for using headings for your headings, lists for your lists, and stuff like that. That's what it's all about. And thanks. Back to Zach.
Thank you for bringing that to everyone's attention. I definitely did not want to risk missing out on that. The last thing that maybe I could add in on that front before we move on, I know that we're often tempted to use headings in a very decorative way. We typically want our text to be eye-catching as possible. That is where the accessibility issues, I think, can come into play here. Because if you are reliant on a screen reader and you have entire sections that are, for whatever reason, made in heading 2, just for the sake of making that text larger, that is going to cause a lot of problems and confusion in the navigation for people who have to use screen readers. So that is one of the things I would also recommend avoiding as well, using headings in an overly artistic or decorative way.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm not sure. I haven't used the editor that much. Is it possible to make text bigger just arbitrarily without using headings?
No, the way it's built, we don't really have a whole lot of customization options for text that's something like Microsoft Word has, for example.
Right.
That's just, and I believe the biggest reason for that is because it's meant to be one of those guardrails.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. But that's a really good point, what you brought up about just because you want something big doesn't mean that it should be a heading.
Right. Sometimes depending on what you're working on, you might be able to bold it. But for the most part, I would just be very careful of not doing that, using headings as a decorative thing. I'm going to check the chat to see if there's any questions. I saw one pop up, but right now, this is the last thing that we'll probably talk about with the HTML stuff. So cleaning up your source code. This hasn't been a major issue I've noticed, but it's good to keep in mind when you copy content over from a PDF or a Word document. Drupal is good at cleaning up your code if it's from a Word document, not so much if it's from a PDF. It can usually detect whether something is written in PDF code or a Microsoft Word code. And you'll notice sometimes this little discrepancy between how your fonts look. If you've carried over some code that might not be good to have on there. So all of our body text is written in a serif font, and our headings are generally sans serif. But if you happen to notice the body text being serif, like this one to the right here, that means usually there's some non-semantic code in there. In this case, it's just a div tag. It's usually a good practice to go into the source code if you see this and try to just delete that tag. That way it resets it back to how the template is supposed to look like, how the font is supposed to look like, I mean. This isn't necessarily a huge deal, but it does help make sure that the navigation experience a screen reader has is more smooth, essentially. You're making it an easier, better experience just by making sure that you're getting rid of some of this junk code that shouldn't be there. So now that we've covered all there is to know about HTML, we're going to be talking about the Word docs and the PDFs. So the next best practice that we recommend here, if you need to have a downloadable file on your page, this is where we suggest converting an accessible Word document into a PDF. So this gives your users the benefit of an already accessible document, while also more or less giving them the convenience of PDF. And in that way, you're making sure that your PDF is already accessible. You've already covered that ground once you've converted it. And we'll cover the steps on how to do that next. So when you're starting this process, you just want to make sure that your document is already accessible in Word. And this includes a few practices like making sure that you run the Word accessibility checker and just to see if there are any errors or warnings, anything that might catch your eye that might need corrected or fixed. And this also includes using styles as much as possible for formatting a document. And this more or less means using things like headings instead of bold text when you want to provide structure to the document. It's similar to a web page in that respect. You're using the same tools to provide structure and ease of navigation. And this also includes using lists instead of tables within a document. So some of these principles that apply to HTML also apply to Word documents. Is there anything that you want to add on this, Jeff?
Yeah, I think if you actually need a table, like for tabular data where, you're saying you've got a header row or maybe a header column that, helps you organize a grid of data, then that can be fine. I think what you're saying about lists instead of tables is sort of like using a table to help you like format stuff, like, maybe space it out the way you want in a list, something like that.
Yeah. There are just times I know when it's not practical to use lists over tables to display tabular data.
Yeah.
And there are ways to accessibly make tables in Word. It's it's usually just a safer bet in terms of accessibility. I think, and maybe you can weigh on this, Jeff.
Yeah,
To use
tables can get
lists.
complicated. And a
Yeah.
quick tip is the thing in Word. I just learned this recently is that the table tool where I forget exactly where it is, but you just like hover over it or click on it, and then you like drag out like a 2x4 or a 2x8 kind of table. That way of creating tables has a lot of problems. I don't know why. Um, but apparently the best way to go about that is to go through the process of insert table. There's probably another way to do it, but avoid that little click and drag thing where you just pick the cells and dimensions that you want. That one's trouble.
Yeah, it's really one of those things where sure it's more convenient when you're making the table, but in the long run, it's not an accessible practice. Yeah, do you feel like there's anything else that we could maybe add to this part in the process of making your Word document accessible, or do you think we're good to go?
Um, I think at the level of complexity you're at, we're good to go.
Okay, so moving on. Next step is just saving the document as a PDF once you've already checked it for accessibility. And the process for doing that is slightly different if you're depending on the device you're using. So for example, if you're using a Mac like I am, you typically go to File and you choose, oh, I see Layla, do you have a question?
Hi, sorry. Raise my hand because I think I'll forget afterwards. So
Okay.
going back to the tables,
Mhm.
one of the things we use a lot is like a curriculum template where we have the classes that the students should take and then they'll fill it in. And tables are the ways we've been doing that. Do you have a suggestion of, because like we have to make the template available for everyone or anyone who wants to download it so that they can fill in their things. Um, I haven't been using a fillable PDF for some reason. I don't know why. But do you have any other strategies of how we can address this or make it more accessible?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like a legitimate use of a table to me. Um, the one thing that you would want to do is to make sure that it's constructed using insert table. If you want to put headings and stuff on that, I would need to look up exactly what you'd need to do. If you want to share one of those, an example of one of those with us, yeah, go right ahead and we can take a look at it.
Sounds good. I'll send you an email after.
Okay,
Thank you.
super.
Oh, I noticed there's another one from Kylie. I'm just going to read this out loud. I was told that the preference was 1, HTML, 2, read-only Word document, and 3, PDF, because PDFs are always going to appear on the Pope Tech report, even if it's accessible. Are you saying that saying the accessible Word document or saving the accessible Word document as a PDF is better than the read-only Word document? I would say yes, but Jeff can give a better answer than I can.
Yeah, like Zach was talking about in the beginning, it's sort of like they both have their pluses and minuses. With Word documents, you don't have to go through the process of making a PDF. It's a little bit harder for people to deal with, but if it's something where you know your audience, maybe the Word document is fine. If you want it accessible to the broadest audience, I would say go with PDF. If you have a document that's super complicated, this is the part where Word can really fall down. And PDF gives you the ability to really get in and annotate things in your document to make them accessible. Word just doesn't have those capabilities. But if you take something that you create in Word and it's in pretty good shape and it needs to be enhanced a little bit as a PDF, um, that's another way where PDF can really outshine Word documents. And I realize this is getting kind of complicated. If you have a fairly simple document, honestly, either way can work. But for reaching a broader audience, you'd want to go with the PDF.
I'm going to just cover the process real quick of converting. It's a document to a PDF. It's pretty simple. Like I said, when you're in Word, you're just going to File and you're choosing Save As. And you're just making sure, if you're on a Mac, well, actually this applies to, for your file format, you want it to be PDF. Kind of obvious, right? The next steps are a little bit different for each one. So if you're on a Mac, there's going to be a circle like there is to the right that says best for electronic distribution and accessibility. On a PC, it's a little bit different because there's a button called Options that you have to click, and then that presents you a drop-down menu, and then there will be a box that you check, and it will say something like ISO 1905 compliant. Kind of like a wordier way of basically saying what the Mac version is saying, but these are more or less doing the same thing. This is it's a 4-step process to convert Word to PDF. And this is an optional part. You don't necessarily have to do this. This is just something that you can explore if you want. So you can check for a PDF's accessibility in Adobe Acrobat. And it's a pretty simple process too. You open it in Adobe Acrobat. You find the All Tools tab that will be on the left. There'll be an option that says Prepare for Accessibility. And within that menu, there's another one that says Check for Accessibility as well. And that gives you the option to start checking. And that produces a report that tells you if there's any changes that you need to make, or if there's something that you have to manually check that the accessibility checker can't review itself. But like I said, this is not something that you have to do, because for the most part, when you're converting from an already accessible Word document, you're pretty good. You're pretty much good to go already. This is just an optional thing you can do just to kind of check your bases if you want, but it's not mandatory that you have to do this. It's just, it's one of those things that's a good habit to have, but there's really nothing to force you to do that. So we have about 14, 15 minutes. I'd like to open up this time for the Q&A. I tried to kind of keep this presentation a little bit more concise, but we were actually getting some very good questions in the chat. So we've already kind of used some of that during the presentation. So the rest of this time, feel free to ask any questions. If there's really no other questions beyond this, we can wrap up a little bit early if you want. I'm going to provide not only the slides, but also a recording of the presentation online. And like I said earlier, I'll also be making sure that there is this resource to reference later on the ASC Tech website. If there's anything else I'm forgetting, I don't think I'm forgetting anything. Jeff, is there like a final thing that you'd like to add before we sign off?
I do have a link to something in Buckeye Learn that's a pretty well condensed accessibility for content creators course. It covers a little bit of stuff about documents, but the rest of it is all like general accessibility information that is useful when you're thinking about making documents. It covers stuff like color contrast. It talks about alt text a little bit. The stuff you already know, you can just skim through, but it's just a nice reminder of the things to keep in mind as you're designing documents. But that can go out in a follow-up email or something like that.
Yeah, I can push that out into the newsletter, and there's the Microsoft Teams group as well. So again, thanks for everyone for being here. Jeff, I really appreciate your time as well. I know you did a lot of the heavy lifting there. So yeah, thanks again, everybody. I'll have this up in a few days. So take care and have a good rest of the week.